Okay, hello. Lost immediately. So yes, my name is Wright. I work at the Oxford Internet Institute, which is it's a department of the University of Oxford. It's in the social sciences faculty. As you heard, my background is in computer science, and I moved out of a realm of working in sort of very formal mathematical computer science towards dealing with a lot more of the softer issues related to privacy and how it affects us as individuals. Now, the title for this panel that was sent out was Beyond Control, Data, Privacy and Rights. And that's a huge job to talk through all of those issues. But what I wanted to do to some extent was give almost initially a timeline of how we got to where we are and what I consider is important when considering privacy and how it affects us on the internet in the world we live in today. And I think one of the things that we often forget when we're talking about computing technologies, information technologies, privacy in the internet, is ultimately this is all about informational privacy. This is all about informational control. And the very first time as humans that we let go of personal individual control over information was way back when we started writing it down. That was the first point that it became something that moved beyond the completely personal sphere. The ability to write things down, to put our thoughts on paper, as was mentioned in the introduction, is a hugely powerful technology. It allows us to put down a thought to last for eternity, for all time. It allows us to distribute information widely, and it allows it to be criticised and critiqued by other people who are reading it. So writing was this initial subversive, disruptive technology that changed the way that we treated our thoughts and our communications. And to some extent, that comes up against a fundamental problem in human psychology, in that we make certain default assumptions about information that are very hard to overcome. One of those is that information is to some extent scarce. If we come up with a thought or an idea, then we're the one that's holding it, and actually distributing that information is relatively hard, because you have to say it to somebody, you have to replicate that information somehow. Even when we started to write down information, it's very difficult to make a copy of that information. It's very difficult to spread it widely. You have to carry a physical letter or a clay tablet or something like that around. The information by default that we communicate with other people is mutable. It changes over time. So if we're relying on word of mouth, then we have the classic game of Chinese whispers, where I say something to you and something is put forward to the next person, the next person, the next person, and changes over time. And it's limited to those channels of distribution that are available to us. So an interpersonal communication is limited to how far I can shout. When we write it down, it has to be physically transmitted somewhere. And then we broke some of those assumptions a little bit by inventing computers, by inventing information technologies. As opposed to information communication technologies at that point, the initial computers allowed us to store and to replicate large amounts of information in the sense that we couldn't generally have replicated on paper easily. But it gave us the ability to gather, the ability to store, the ability to process and analyse information at a far greater scale than we could with human endeavour. And that allowed sort of new possibilities for what we could do with data, and that gave us the desire and the ability to gather more information than we had before. We suddenly realised this was really useful stuff and we could do very important things with it. One of the other things it gave us was a level of assurance that the data that was stored by and large in computers doesn't shift. If you write something down in a computer in a particular form, it doesn't tend to change over time unless we explicitly tell it to. So the next step, obviously, in that was when we developed the internet, and that's what we're really talking about in this sense. And this is where we added to that ability to store, analyse, process information, the ability to replicate it, not just perfectly and not just cheaply, but globally to as many people as we wanted. We could make perfect copies of information, and they could be spread around the world globally. If you had a thought, all of a sudden it wasn't something you had to say to the person next to you and they might relay it to the next person. You can put it up on a web page and billions of people around the world can read it and have access to it. But the story of the sort of ability to distribute information didn't stop there, obviously, because we start to develop technologies on top of this underlying medium of the internet. And I think the sort of big shift that came along next was clearly the social media revolution, where we started to actively share information about ourselves in our personal lives. And I think the big shift that occurred with social media was that we started to use the technologies of the internet, started to use information technologies to manage aspects of our daily lives that we had hitherto managed in a very informal and very sort of personalised sense. So social media all of a sudden became the definition of what a relationship was between two people in some senses. Obviously it's far deeper than that, but we got an abstracted version of a relationship. You like this piece of information, you are friends with this person because you are friends with this person on Facebook. You are in a relationship because you're in a relationship on Facebook. That doesn't define us, but it's how we've started to represent that. There's a wonderful quote, I think originated with Ross Anderson from Cambridge, where he points out the sort of evolutionary necessity of using Facebook in the modern world, where he said, if you are, say, a student starting to study at university right now, and you're not on Facebook, then you don't get invited to parties. Mm-hmm. You know, if you don't get invited to parties, you don't get to meet members of the opposite sex. If you don't meet members of the opposite sex, then you don't have sex. If you don't have sex, then you don't reproduce. If you don't reproduce, then your gene line dies out. So Facebook, you know, in this sense, has become, all credit to Ross Anderson for that one, but this has become our sort of evolutionary necessity to take part in social media. As somebody who made his Facebook profile 2 weeks ago, I think entirely on the bequest of my wife. But what that, and to some extent, you know, social media trades on this wonderful thing about us as humans in that we like to share information. We love to share information. We love to make interpersonal connections with each other. But it's allied with a profit motive. These services are not there clearly for our benefit. They're there as a means to make profit for Facebook, for Google, for advertising companies. And that profit motive is designed to ensure that we get as much information shared on these social media sites as possible. We want to be continually sharing, continually updating, continually creating this social web. And then that moves us into not a new era, but an enhanced era of surveillance, which is, I think, the main issue that we're going to talk about today. And the contrast I wanted to make in surveillance is when we talk about surveillance, we typically think about the NSA, the GCHQ, the intelligence services watching everything we do. But to a large extent, what social media has produced is this inherent and intrinsically motivated personal surveillance of ourselves. We have started to surveil ourselves and share that information willingly. When we look at the outcomes of the Snowden revelations, we see the capabilities of the intelligence services, and we look at the structure of the internet and how it's built, when we look at the infrastructure of what we've built, this technology, it's the most amazing tools for surveillance that humanity could ever have conceived of, that I can imagine. But by and large, the intelligence services, who tend to be the main concern, they have to fight us for the data. You know, they have to go out there and they have to tap cables and they have to hack into computers and they have to pull things off the internet. But the social media companies, they just build the service and we come to them and throw data at them. Far more data than an intelligence service would want to get access to. They've got your photos on a day-to-day basis, your thoughts, your likes, the things that you're reading. And for me, what came out of the Snowden revelations, the most terrifying thing that came out of it was when the two of those were combined. And I think the key to that was the PRISM program that came out of the NSA, which was where the intelligence services, rather than this adversarial attempt to rip data out of the structure of the internet and surveil individuals, they simply went to Google and Facebook and other companies and said, give us the data. And it was there ready for them, waiting for them. And I think in terms of surveillance, in terms of the ability to act anonymously or privately on the internet, this coordination between the state intelligence services and the private corporations that we share data with openly and willingly and eagerly is probably the most terrifying thing I've seen since I've started working on internet policy. By default, nowadays, most people use the internet largely through, certainly the web. The web has become the underlying technology that most people use. But that's then become further coordinated into Facebook and Google. The number of people whose experience of the internet is simply using Facebook. In fact, one of the things that we do at the OII is run a UK-wide internet survey. And there are a large number of people who, when you ask them about their internet use, they'll say, I don't use the internet. I used to use the internet, but I don't use it anymore. And when you drill down into that a little bit more, you'll find that there are plenty of people who are accessing Facebook on their phone, but they don't consider that using the internet. That's just functioning in society these days. You know, they actually identify as non-internet users, but they're logging onto Facebook, posting messages on Twitter all the time. And this centralization and commodification of services that manage our interpersonal relationships is what is building a sort of an ever greater invasion of privacy. And we lack an ability, going all the way back to our inability to deal with the implications of writing, implications of communications technologies. We have an inability to judge when we share a piece of information, when we tell our friends something, when we do something on the internet and share it. We have an ability to understand the effects of that, the implications of that, and the inferences that can be made from the combination of all that data. It's not just you share a photo of you doing something slightly silly, and that is something that somebody can see. It's that all of those little data points get drawn together into a huge picture of your life, a profile, a predictive profile of what you're going to do. So where can we go from that? It's not a very optimistic picture. Certainly I think the underlying thing we have to say is that privacy as a right is something that has only been explicitly expressed in the last 100, 120 years or so. It's something we've had intuitively, but we've only started to formalise it legally and now technically in the last century. But it varies widely and it develops all the time. Privacy, some people have said that privacy is dead, and I think that that's wrong, and I think it's harmful to express things in those terms. But certainly privacy is going to have to change, because the technological infrastructure we've built doesn't allow privacy in the sense that we have had it to now as an intrinsic, intuitive, understood right. What we have to do instead is to look at where privacy can go within the structure we've built. And we need to look at why we want privacy, or why we could build the sort of society we want to build, and how privacy enables that kind of society. And we need to make explicit active decisions within that framework. And just to finish, I wanted to go a little bit further, because data, privacy and rights is something that we were asked to talk about. And obviously the right we're going to focus on is privacy by and large. But there are lots of rights out there that aren't privacy, as I hope you're aware. And by and large, many of these rights are supported by various aspects of the technology that we build now. And there are increasing concerns that in the way we build technologies, in this purely technological view, purely engineering view of building internet technologies, we tend to encode our assumptions about rights into those technologies. If we talk about privacy, we tend, because the majority of the internet was built by white Western male engineers, we tend to encode this Western ideal of privacy into the protocols when we build privacy-enhancing protocols. But for much of the rest of the internet, we should really consider very deeply the ideas of freedom of expression, freedom of access, equality, justice that we build into these protocols, and how that can be used to affect the society that we want to build in the future. And I'm finished there.